Today's guest presenter is Duncan Kerr. Duncan has a wealth of knowledge and experience from working with healthcare professionals, athletes, singers, patients, researchers, and so many more people for the past 15 years. He has a deep understanding of both the science and the practical application of both inspiratory and expiratory muscle training, making him a trusted educator in this field on an international scale. I am aware that there are a lot of people that work with Duncan and use POWERbreathe as their secret weapon, alongside confidential patient stories that we will not be allowed to share or mention any names of today. But if you do want any further information about the pioneering work that is taking place at POWERbreathe, please do get in contact with us after the webinar. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Duncan, and I thought we could kick off with the first question, Duncan. So I wanted to find out what the respiratory or inspiratory muscles are, and why do they need to be trained like any other muscle?
Okay, right. I'll find it very hard to live up to your introduction, but I have spent the last number of years meeting a great many professionals around the world, top scientists and professors and athletes who use our devices, and I've been able to help them get the best out of using our devices and introduce them to, features and benefits that they may not have been originally aware of. I'll just begin by running through a few slides just to explain, how IMT works and what exactly is IMT or EMT or RMT, depending on which terminology or acronyms you want to use. So if I share screens and so you can find my presentation, and there we go, share and click on to there. Okay. What is IMT? Well, fortunately, somebody sent me a study last night, and this was part of their introduction to their study. I think it's a very good definition. IMT aims to improve the strength and endurance of the diaphragm and extra diaphragmatic muscles through the application of control resistance during inspiration. Essentially, that's exactly what IMT is, and it was developed many, many years ago, over 20 years ago. Even before the Loughborough University device that we developed. And its aim was to improve the performance of athletes, and gradually over time it has morphed into perhaps more of a medical device as well. So, which muscles are you going to train? So, without making IMT too complicated, it's just like resistance training. It's like going to the gym, but training a group of muscles which you can't really see and you can't really feel, and it's hard to train them unless maybe if you're running up and down mountains all the time. And even then, top athletes tend to use the muscles incorrectly and can improve their breathing pattern. And breathing pattern disorders is a whole new area of respiratory muscle physiotherapy. And there are groups that specifically operate in this area, educating not just patients, but also athletes to improve their breathing pattern. So, as a nice ideally, if you're talking to a breathing pattern disorder physiotherapist, I say, well, try not to use your sternocleidomastoid and scalene muscles. You want to primarily use your diaphragm. That's the main muscle of inspiration as it contracts and descends and changes the pressure from inside your lungs to outside your lungs, and therefore the air is sucked in. At the same time, you're using your external intercostals primarily to expand the rib cage to make a bigger area for your lungs to expand into. So it can't make your lungs any bigger, but it can improve the cavity in which your lungs can expand into, so you can maximize your potential lung volume that you've already have. Here's a good image. And diaphragm is very thin, obviously, but it can still be trained. And I've got an ultrasound image later, which will show you how you can improve the thickness of the diaphragm through training. And you can also improve the excursion of the diaphragm, enabling you to essentially suck more air into the lungs. Next slide. Here is another image. So I often explain to people who sometimes don't have a clue, the diaphragm cuts your body completely in half between your heart and lungs and your internal organs, although there are holes for blood and food to get through. It's connected onto your spine, and then there's your psoas there through your pelvis. So it's very important, and there are lots of techniques specifically aimed at training the diaphragm, because the diaphragm's part of the kind of the pressure cylinder that you create with your pelvic floor. But it's not just about breathing, it's also about posture too. So, as I mentioned there, the diaphragm at the top and the pelvic floor at the bottom, just like a Coke can, once you release the pressure, it's floppy. So, you want to maintain the strength of that. The transverse abdominis is also used in squeezing the air out when you breathe out. This is a very good video. It's not one of ours. Credit to Muscle and Motion. It's free on YouTube. I found it on YouTube. I often show it to people because it's a very simple animation and it doesn't have sound, or it does have graphics. So people can actually see what the IMT process is doing. So as you breathe out, the diaphragm pushes up, push the air out, the diaphragm comes down, push the air in. Sternocleidomastoid scalenes are lifting your upper ribs, but ideally you don't want to engage in these too much. You may in certain circumstances, Formula One driver or something, but generally try and avoid using those muscles too much. You have obviously your pectoral muscles, which again helping expand the rib cage. And the intercostal muscles, which are the primary muscles you would use to open up your rib cage. And now we come on to the diaphragm. Most important of lot, say pushing the air out and then sucking the air in. I've met lots of people who totally disagree with me. So, oh, that's not right. That's, when you breathe in, you breathe in. Well, no, you don't. It's the opposite way around. So breathe in, belly out is the easiest way to explain to people who are convinced it's the other way around. Lots of other muscle groups that people aren't too aware of, and I've probably got studies on my laptop in almost every single, medical condition there is, including lower back pain and proprioception from balance, and that's because there are a great number of other muscles that are all involved that can also help with your posture and balance and movement. So I won't carry on too much in this video. If you want to have a look at it, just Google muscle and motion forced inspiration. Here's an ultrasound image of before and after looking at the diaphragm. So that's before and that's after. And that was after a 4-week period of training with POWERbreathe. And that gave an 8 to 12% increase in the thickness and strength of the diaphragm. So why would you train the muscles? Well, they do limit performance, even in elite athletes. If you're an Olympic rower and you're winning by, half a centimeter, then everything you can possibly do to improve your performance, you will do it. And in the past, people would forget about breathing and didn't realize it was a limiting factor until it was proved that it was a limiting factor. And I've met top athletes who train with POWERbreathe, Olympic boxers, mixed martial arts, numerous sports, all the triathlete sports, swim, bike, run, etc., who realize they'll have trained everything else, what's missing? The breathing, and then they can get a marginal gain at that level. But if you're in intensive care in a hospital, then it's a hell of a lot more than a marginal gain. It's a gigantic gain. Posture I've already mentioned. These muscles do fatigue eventually, and certain sports, and if you're a fireman carrying breathing equipment, that's going to limit your ability to move and breathe. Also, if you're in the army carrying a huge burden as well. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you can retrain a poor breathing pattern. In the original research done at Loughborough, it was discovered that it's not going to increase your oxygenation of your blood, so it's not going to give you a benefit in that respect. But if you train your respiratory muscles so they're at their peak form and you have the best breathing pattern, then you can maintain blood flow to your working muscles. As soon as your brain perceives that you're struggling to breathe, and it was defined as a metaboreflex, vasoconstriction, so you reduce blood flow to the locomotor muscles, which will slow you down eventually. But if you can maintain this system for as long as possible before this system kicks in, you're obviously going to go further and faster. And also, if you're mentally aware that you're trying to breathe more diaphragmatically, you can help reduce stress pre any sport, because a lot of people struggle with anxiety and hyperventilation, for example, so you can mentally engage the diaphragm and the respiratory muscles to help overcome this once you know how to do it. This is a good video from a running coach based in Chesterfield. I won't give you his name, but he's prepared to take his shirt off for this video. So that's where he's breathing out, obviously. So contraction of all the six pack, etc. When he breathes in, belly out, breathe out, and then breathe in. So the diaphragm's descending, pushing the stomach contents out, hence the belly breathing concept. When you breathe in, you squeeze all the air out of your lungs, and then it's a change in differential pressure from inside the lungs to the outside air pressure. So how can you train these respiratory muscles? Well, there are numerous devices, the original Respironics devices, and incentive spirometry, which is kind of going out of fashion because it doesn't improve strength. It can give you a kind of visual indication that you're breathing, but it doesn't really increase strength at all. The original Mark 1 POWERbreathe that came out of Loughborough University, and the Plus Mark 2 POWERbreathe, which is redesigned to have better airflow, easier to clean and adjust, etc. And the K series developed by POWERbreathe due to I won't say pressure, but interest in academics and athletes for wanting more feedback, saying, well, that's great and it works, but what volume are we breathing in? How fast are we breathing in? How much energy are we using? So we then developed the K series. So they're known as pressure threshold because the device opens at a preset pressure threshold. Pressure is measured in centimeters of water. So you could set it at, say, for example, the average usual starting pressure would be about 30 centimeters of water. You breathe in, the valve opens, and as long as you can hold that pressure, that 30 centimeter pressure will stay open. But eventually, you run out of steam, the valve shuts, and you don't actually manage to completely finish your breath because you're not strong enough to keep the valve open for that long. The very unique point about the K series devices is that valve head is controlled by the computer, and the computer's measuring your pressure 4,000 times a second, and it can readjust that valve. So it notices you're getting weaker and reduces the resistance to enable you to do a much better breath. But obviously, there's a cost involved. They cost a lot more money. So different types of devices. So there are two different versions of the K series. That's the Plus device. And more recently, we've developed a smart adapter which will fit onto the Plus, which will allow all the information that can be collected from this device to be shown on an iPad or an iPhone or whatever device you're using. And those devices there are expiratory training devices, which we moved into about 2 years ago. Originally, we thought it was a market that was quite small due to the fact inspiration is where all the muscles are doing all the work. It's, 80, 90% of the work of breathing is inspiration. Expiration is recoil. You breathe out and the air squeezed out. You can squeeze out more air. If you're a tennis player, you might be serving and squeezing out even more air. If you're a singer or a musician, you're kind of using more of your upper neck muscles, and therefore you can get a training effect from training the expiratory muscles. We realized from talking to our distributors around the world that in speech and language, expiratory muscle training was very popular. So 2 years ago, we launched a new device for expiratory muscle training, which we think was an improvement over previous devices that were available on the market. I won't go into that. They're basically mucus clearance devices. So the term that was coined many, many years ago, dumbbell for the diaphragm, essentially you are weightlifting, the spring-loaded valve opens at the preset pressure threshold, closes when you can't maintain the pressure, and you can increase the loading, make it harder to make the heavier weight just by rotating the valve. So essentially you're compressing the spring, making it, you've got to put more effort in to be able to open the valve. Yeah, that's an image of the smart adapter, which I can do a quick demo of later. And these are typical screens that you will get on your phone if you're using a smart adapter attached to your Plus device. So you can set up a different device. If you notice, we do them in different colors. So you have a white one, a blue one, a green one. And we also do red ones, black ones, pink ones, and no, I won't say any color you like, but essentially they're categorized into different levels of strength. So you have a light resistance, a medium resistance, and a heavy resistance. The heavy resistance are a bit too heavy and too hard. For the majority of people, the white one's a medic, so it's more for patients, and then the green one is a light resistance, and the blue one is a medium resistance. So you can set up your device. It also works with the expiratory trainers and also the shakers. Then you have a home screen showing you all the different data that you've collected over the time you'd be using it, including your current strength test. And you can set up different protocols. There's a standard built-in protocol, 30 breaths twice a day for 7 days a week. That is the standard protocol for inspiratory muscle training. Um, and percentages is very debatable. The standard percentage is 50% of your maximum inspiratory pressure, but there are studies in different areas where they're going from as low as 10% to as high as 75%. And there's more research going on into what is the correct resistance for the type of training that you're trying to achieve. And again, the most recent study that I read last night was saying that the higher resistance you train at, the harder the perception is, and there are people less inclined to do it. And with reading many other, doing a kind of meta-analysis of different potential resistances, 50% still seems to be the optimum level to train at. Instead of having a spring-loaded valve where you just use the device and you don't get any feedback, when you use the smart adapter, each breath you take, you will produce a graph so you can see when the valve opens, how long you keep the valve open for, and then when it closes. So it gives you that visual feedback. And at the end of the session, it will tell you various parameters such as the time to open the valve there is 0.2 seconds. The valve was open for 0.9 seconds. That's quite good, that. The person did 22 breaths, but only 20 were successful, so 90.9% success rate. Other key parameters would be the load that they had it set at and the load that they actually achieved, which will be shown on here. And the performance index, that just gives you one number, which takes all the other parameters into account to give you one simple number. So provided you always do the same number of breaths every time, that is a very good number to compare all your training sessions, and you'd obviously like that number to go up over time. Moving on to the electronic taper devices, that's the valve head, which can be removed, that's controlled by the computer. And the good thing about these devices is they're very good for training people, particularly people who have a poor breathing pattern, and that the ones that do connect to a computer, not all of them do, some are just handheld. That is one that doesn't connect to a computer. Some are mainly designed for patients to use at home, and this is the one that can be used in a hospital connected to a computer. So with these devices, you're able to do a MIP test and you're able to show a good breathing pattern on the computer screen, which then the patient can try and follow. And usually it only takes about 15 breaths and they can figure out, okay, so you're telling me to breathe more diaphragmatically, sit more upright, have a more up, don't use my neck muscles. And eventually they can actually achieve a much better breath. So if they're given one of these or one of the mechanical devices to take home, they have a much better idea of how to use it correctly. So as I mentioned before, it tapers the load, so it's not a fixed constant load. You might set one of these at 50, but when you go to the results at the end, it might say you've actually hit, 35. That's because the load was tapered over the length and time that you took the breath. They're very accurate, sample at 4,000 times per second and can adjust the valve very quickly. And the real-time software is very good, as I just mentioned, educating the patients. And you can store up to 1,000 patients or athletes if you wanted, and all that data would be saved in all their training, and all their MIP scores, so you can monitor their progress and monitor their improvement. And just like any form of training, eventually you'll get to a point where it's more difficult to keep improving in big chunks and they get smaller and smaller. But at that time, you could switch to more of a maintenance training load and do it maybe 3 times a week as opposed to twice a day, 7 days a week. This graph here shows the benefit of doing the tapered load. So over the full length of the breath, you're actually doing more work because you're doing a longer breath, even though the average load is declining with a standard threshold device set at, this is one set at 80% of it, which is obviously quite hard. You would get that far through the breath and then the valve would close. So you wouldn't maximize your volume and flow, but they are still very good for building strength. Expiratory muscle training devices, as I mentioned before, they basically reverse the inspiratory muscle. Instead of the valve opening upwards, the valve, as you blow out through the device, the valve opens downwards, and you have to maintain that pressure downwards. These are usually used at higher pressures to help develop the muscles in the neck in speech and language with conditions like dysphagia, for example, maybe people who have Parkinson's or a stroke and have difficulty swallowing, and you can help train the muscles. I can never pronounce this, oropharyngeal muscles and muscles around the neck to help, improve swallowing, for example. And just to give you an illustration, this is a X-ray fluoroscopy video from, I think it's from Brazil, but this is on 10 centimeters of water, so you can hear and see, and now it's on 80 centimeters of water, so you can see it's actually working these muscles as opposed to an inspiratory muscle training where you're primarily working your diaphragm. Here's a young lady also using one of these connected to a tracheostomy.
Vai, força!
This is a video that came from Brazil. And as mentioned earlier, you will get some athletes using these devices, particularly maybe singers and musicians and tennis players, for example. But primarily they're used in speech, language, and voice swallowing departments. SLT, speech and language therapists, use them for people who have obviously have problems, maybe neck cancer surgery, and who have difficulty swallowing. And that's it for the slides. I'll close the slides and then see if you have any questions, Sabrina, and then I can do a live demo of the devices.
Thank you, Duncan. I think you've managed to condense an overview of respiratory muscle training and the POWERbreathe devices into a very short space of time, which is some feat.
I have to, because visiting hospitals, they go in, they say you've got half an hour, so I have to speak quickly.
I suppose one thing we were talking about in the office this week is, can you explain, or what's the difference or reason why we would use respiratory muscle training devices as opposed to just doing breathing exercises, which we often hear about a lot these days?
Yeah, well, breathing exercises are important, and we're a device manufacturer, so we don't tell people how to breathe per se. There are lots of groups such as Bradcliffe in New Zealand, and then there's Buteyko breathing. There are various long established, well credited breathing training physiotherapy groups, for example. So we let them get on with it. During COVID, lots of people came out of the woodwork who became, oh, I'm a breath work guru, and came up with lots of esoteric types of breathing and going off to very expensive training camps, etc. So we don't get involved in that. And there's other people, excuse me, like Wim Hof, and he's been quite successful in his breathing training, for example. So I think we'd stick to the ones that we're familiar with. The Bradcliffe, Dina Bradley, Tanya Clifton Smith have been doing that for a very long time, focusing primarily on diaphragmatic and intercostal breathing. There are lots of different types of techniques. There's what's the oxygen advantage and box breathing. So there are numerous techniques and people can read them, but I'd say stick to the foundation of diaphragm and intercostals, build on that technique, build the strength of your respiratory muscles, and then you can always read more and go into using other different patterns or techniques which might be more specific for your requirements.
Mhm. I suppose it's a bit like the concept of you've got to learn your basics. So go to the gym
Exactly.
and do a squat. And then when you understand the basics, then you can start building in the weight to start seeing an incremental change or difference to your strength.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. Okay. This might be a difficult question because we obviously have to be very mindful of confidentiality. And as I said at the beginning, I know lots of people, particularly elite professionals, use inspiratory and expiratory muscle devices for those small gains and they don't want to tell people. Are there any particular examples of people that you've worked with that you might be able to share, or I guess cohorts of patients where you think that there's a significant benefit to using these devices?
Yes, well, for example, earlier on in the year, you and I both visited an Olympic training centre where an Olympic silver medalist was using our device, and he was using actually the K5, and he was so impressed with it from his own usage. And actually, I think he was a Wim Hof fan as well. Oh no, it was Oxygen
These
Advantage.
oxygen advantage,
Yeah,
yeah.
that was it. And he runs his own separate coaching school, and he's now using the K5 to coach his athletes. And
Hmm.
that's without giving any names away.
Hmm.
And in my travels, I've met world heavyweight boxing champions coach and the Ukrainian school of boxing. And I've been to the Ukraine, believe it or not, a long time ago and visited the university there where the Klitschko brothers studied boxing, and they use POWERbreathe there, and they've used it for a very long time. So
Hmm.
they perceive the benefits. I know professors at, for example, John Dickinson at Kent University works with boxers quite a lot
Mm.
and can see the benefit of their recovery. For example, you fight for 3 minutes, you sit down and you can't get your breath back, and by the time you're ready, you back up for another 3 minutes fighting. And boxers can get a big benefit from the IMT training in that they can sit down, recover very quickly compared with people that haven't done IMT training.
Hmm.
We also met lots of rowers, swimmers, cyclists. Our distributor in the Netherlands has worked with many Tour de France teams. But as you said at the end in the introduction, it's a secret weapon. You don't want to tell your competitor, "Hey, I'm using this. This is making me better than you." You're not going to tell anybody. Maybe when they retire, they'll be happy to tell somebody, or maybe they've got secret ways of using it and different protocols that nobody else knows about, and therefore they're quite happy to mention it a little bit. But if it's in a competitive environment and it's going to give you an advantage, you're generally not going to tell anybody. And our distributors around the world, the first thing they always say, "Oh yeah, such a body's using it," and such a yeah, but we can't tell anybody. And I remember a meeting a French footballer who played in a World Cup final, had a World Cup winners medal, and he bought a K5 for himself and his mother. And he said, "Yeah, you can put it on your website." And the day after, we got a phone call from his image rights manager saying, "Oh, you're not allowed to do that." "Why not?" He said we could. "Oh, it doesn't matter what he says. We own his image rights. So
Mm.
you can't win. So you can't create too much publicity. Just that, people do use them and it is their secret weapon." And
Mm.
then at the opposite end of the spectrum, I visit hospitals and well, two examples, but I'll just mention one of them, a physiotherapist at a hospital. It's a brand new hospital in London. So he'd recruited a new team, and obviously it wasn't like St. Thomas's where everyone's running around and no time. He had time to work with a patient who he'd inherited, who had been on a ventilator for 500 days, which you being a doctor will know that's very unusual,
Mm.
if unheard of. So he was able to ask two of his physios every day to go and work with this particular patient using the electronic tapered load devices because that's better because the patients are very weak and you can start at a low resistance and the load's tapered. and they were able to train with one of these connected to tracheostomy, and eventually he weaned the person off the ventilator very successfully. And I've got other examples of that as well, with transplant patients, for example, where they've benefited from re-educating their breathing because the brain doesn't know they've got new organs. It still thinks they've got their old lungs, for example. So with the
Mhm.
visual feedback, they can improve their breathing training and develop the capacity and movement of their respiratory muscles, obviously, to inflate the new lungs.
So I suppose it's fairly safe to say, and the evidence does support this, that really there's very few people that wouldn't benefit from respiratory muscle training. Obviously, the gains are more significant if you are unwell or have a medical condition, and if you're competing at a high level in a sport. But even if you're healthy, there's benefit to be gained. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I mean, I meet people say, well, I've been breathing since I was born, so I don't need one of these. And okay, if you're not breathing, you're dead. So therefore, you don't necessarily need one of these. But on the far end of the spectrum, someone in ICU and a gold medal, potential gold medalist, it makes all the world of difference to them. It is vital to them improving their chances. Whereas the closer you get to the average person in the middle, then the less benefits there are.
Hmm.
But as mentioned earlier, with people who suffer from stress and anxiety, and they can retrain to breathe more diaphragmatically, and it's our devices are it's a tool to help them engage and feel what they're doing and reinforce it and strengthen it. And everything's got to be habitual. If everyone starts off in January going down to the gym, and by the end of February, the gyms are empty again because they've all given up. So
Hmm.
you've got to create a habit. It's got to be a habit forming. So you've got to, like cleaning your teeth, have your POWERbreathe there and morning and evening and do it at the same time. Once you're building that habit, you start to feel the benefits. So even, I meet physios in Sheffield, for example, who work with people with COPD. And they may be even on supplementary oxygen. They watch the TV all day and they're saying, well, this will benefit you. And they're kind of, oh, will it? And what they say is, well, keep it by your chair when the adverts come on, pick your POWERbreathe up, do as many breaths as you can, then put it down. And the feedback is, oh, I walked to the shops and I didn't get out of breath the other day, or I walked up the stairs. So that's probably going off from the average person, but even people who just go to the shops and bike, are going to benefit. Or people get
Yeah.
stressed out driving in traffic, they can say, "Oh, hang on, don't get angry, just relax and do some deep breaths."
Yeah.
And the devices will just help reinforce and encourage them to do that.
Yeah, I think you have to try it to understand that you can feel some benefit, whether you're healthy or not, or less healthy. There's obviously some more questions that we wanted to cover, but it might be quite nice if you're able to do a demonstration of one of the devices. I know we've had some interest about the K series.
Yeah.
Whilst you're setting up, somebody has asked a question that I think we often get asked, is there any benefit of doing inspiratory muscle training whilst you're doing an exercise, for example? I think I'll let you answer
Um,
it.
People do it. I've seen it done. I once watched a guy pedaling at, I can't remember how many watts, quite high wattage, say 300, 400 watts on a static bike, and at the same time using a K5 where they kept increasing the resistance every minute until he got to a stage where he got off the bike and he was sick. So pushing it to that extent, I don't think it's too beneficial. I've seen other videos where one of the benefits, and I've seen other studies linked to this, for example, if you are using it on a bike, the benefit is when you actually take it out of your mouth because your brain doesn't have to concentrate on two things, and suddenly you think, whoa, you rock it off. And they did experiments with people riding bikes and giving them lots of maths questions. And then when they stopped giving them the maths questions, suddenly they were able to ride the bike a lot faster.
Mm.
So I think you can train in sport specific positions. So if you're riding a bike, you could lean over in that specific position, or if you're running, obviously an upright posture. If you're in kayaking, for example, you sit down with your legs out straight. So sport specific. And I think once you've trained, I would always use it on its own first and build up that good technique. And then once you've done that, then you could experiment doing that. I've seen people on rowing machines using them as well. So you can combine the two.
I think your
Um,
your point's really valid because I have read some papers that suggest you perhaps shouldn't do both. It's a bit like the reason why you shouldn't do IMT and EMT at the same time. Maybe it sounds too
yeah,
simple.
you
You
don't do
obviously
either
wouldn't.
to the best of
Yeah,
your ability.
you need to do both and do them properly. Your point, I think, is really important. Learn the technique first, and then particularly if you are doing a sport. So you mentioned the Olympian that we both saw. I think I can probably reveal who it is just because he's actually going to be speaking on the platform. It's Adam
Okay.
Burgess. He'll be speaking in April, and he's got a world of knowledge about breathing training and power breathe devices. And he did some training in his canoe as well, which obviously is really important because he's in a fairly unique posture and position when he's training. So I think that's kind of probably the right way to go about it. Learn the technique
Yeah.
and then you can progress from there.
Well, interestingly, as you mentioned his name, when we met him, he's very focused on breathing through the nose because it warms, moisturizes,
Mhm.
and filters the air, obviously. And you're obviously far better breathing through your nose than breathing through your mouth. And but if you use a power breathe, you that's 30 breaths out of what do you say was 22,000
About
breaths.
22,000, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a very small number of breaths out of the total breaths you take to actually breathe through your mouth. And it's the best way of training the same muscles that you are using when you're breathing through your nose. So we always say, always breathe through your nose for as long as possible. And I do a lot of running. I used to run marathons and fell races, and I just do park runs now. But I try and breathe through my nose for as long as possible to gain that benefit. And you also get a benefit of release of nitric oxide, which dilates your blood vessels, so you get better blood flow as well. So I always try and breathe through my nose for as long as possible, but then eventually you can't be, if you're running flat out up a hill, for example. Um, but you can get that benefit for as long as possible, and you also re-educate your brain to cope with the high levels of carbon dioxide. So there's a there's a lot more into that, which he'll go into in his
Yeah.
presentation.
But we often get asked the question, as you've just said, we promote nasal breathing, but in order to train your respiratory muscles, as far as I'm aware, there isn't a device that would enable you to do that through the nose. You need the bigger space, and obviously you're doing that through the mouth.
Yeah, well, probably half a dozen years ago or so, there was a big fad at one time with altitude training masks, and obviously they were fake because you can't replicate altitude at sea level. It's impossible. You might be wearing a mask, which makes it a lot harder to breathe, and you like to get very sweaty and spots on your face, and also you making it extremely hard to breathe. So you can't really train the muscles to the maximum because you're really struggling to breathe wearing a face mask. And they've now died out. And you do get every now and then waves of new gadgets that come in and they look cool and fashionable. And then people realize actually they don't work and people stop using them.
Mm. As you set up, I don't know if you're going to do a case series demonstration or a
I
smart
can,
adapter.
yes.
One question has just been about if you can go into a little bit of detail about the parameters or the metrics that are shown on the case series and why they're important. I think flow is often worth mentioning, particularly because there are flow devices out there, and PowerBreathe offer tapered loading and threshold devices. So what the difference is?
Yeah. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah.
Jolly good. Move that out to the way somewhere. Well, I'll just run through this first, and I'll talk about the stream flow and tapered flow, for example. So this is a POWERbreathe KH2, and I've set it up to be able to do a maximum inspiratory pressure test, MIP. So if I click on the start button, find the filter. So we use the ERS ATS guidelines of breathing in for maybe 3 seconds, but it takes the 1 second average. So someone who's relatively strong can hold a breath for 1 second, uh, pretty constant, but someone who's quite weak can't and might get a high peak in pressure, but then it drops off. Hence, it's the 1 second average, and you have to be able to repeat it at least 3 times for it to count as accurate. So, well, here we go. I won't go too mad. So on that breath, I got a score of 120. Um, the software is quite good in that the best that's ever been done by this person to QE was 144.77. So that's kind of motivating me saying, well, actually, you're below your best on that one. See if you can improve. So I'll try better. So on that breath, I got a score of 148.46. So that breath was now higher than my previous personal best. So my personal best is the red dotted line, and the black one I've just done is my new personal best. Again, it could have been flatter. I could have held that pressure a bit longer, actually peaked at 158 if I was able to keep that going for the full 1 second. So that was a 1.7 second breath, and that's my 1 second average. So if I do another, try and beat that again. So all those breaths are within 20% of each other. So it's saying, well done, you've recorded your highest score of 148 point. We're very accurate here, 459. If I do, it will allow me to do 5. So if I do one more, so that one wasn't as good, so it's ignored that one. And I'll have one last go to see if I can do a better breath than my current best. So tried a bit harder then. So my best score was 156.35, and I can say okay and say yes, give myself a smiley face, and that's now saved in the memory. So I can now click on review and MIP test. So here are 24 different MIP tests. That's the one I've just done now, 156. That's the one that was done on Monday. That was 144. That's another reason 141, and that was 147. So this was an exhibition at the QE Centre in Westminster. That's why it's got this title, but I've just used this. These are all random different people. That's hence they're all going up and down. What you'd like to see is if someone's done a MIP test and then they've started training to see a gradual trend in improvement in their MIP until they get to the point where they've peaked. So from that 156, I can then switch it to the training mode. Cool. Yeah. So if I go to training, so in this view, it will show flow and volume in this view. I can show 4 views, power, flow, load, and energy, or 3 views, or 2 views where it's shown flow and load, but leave it on that one for the moment. And I can set the resistance. Well, firstly, it's on the default of 30 breaths. I don't have to use 30 breaths. I could switch it to 150 breaths if I wanted, although I'm not like to do 150 breaths. Well, I have a couple of custom ones that I've set up. That one is 10 breaths, where each breath gets a little bit harder. And I set up another custom one where it's 15 breaths, where it gets a little bit harder every time. But people tend to use it on the standard default. You don't have to do all 30. You can always stop at any time, but it will allow you to do 30 and then it will automatically stop. I can set the resistance manually or automatically. If I have it on automatic, at the moment set on automatic 50%, I could set it 40, 50, all the way up to 80. But leaving it automatic on 50%, what will happen is on the first 2 breaths, it will do an S index test, a strength index test, which uses the speed of my breath in liters per second. So the faster I breathe, it calculates that I'm obviously stronger, and it will automatically create my resistance. So for example, if I scored 100 on the first 2 breaths, it would say, okay, we can set his resistance at 50% of 100, which is 50. So my resistance is set at 50. Alternatively, I can take it off auto and put it on manual. So because I got a maximum of, call it 150 before, I can then set my resistance at half of 150. So I can set it at 75, for example. That's ready to go now. So even though it says three, the first four breaths are building up to 75. It will start on three. The second one will be three. They're quite easy. They'll always be the same because is similar to the auto calibration in when using it in auto. And if I click start and just do five breaths. Hmm, That's a bad one. So two good ones and then a bad one. The fact that I've done a bad breath doesn't really matter because it's still increasing my resistance. It's now gone up to 56. Put a bit more effort into there. So now the resistance is on 75. So my objective is to maintain, looking at that graph there, to get the highest flow rate. So flow rates on the vertical scale. So maximize my liters per second and then keep the breath going for as long as possible until, and it will be tapering the load to maximize my volume. So if I look at that one there, I'm hitting 3.8 liters at 4.92 liters per second. Now, I can actually show you the tapered load if I click to this view. So if you look at the bottom, that's showing how the load's starting at a high level and then it's tapering down to almost zero. So the average load, even though I set it at 75, the average load over a 3.7 second breath was 50 centimeters of water. And on the scale at the top, I was breathing at a maximum speed of 4.92 liters per second and hitting 3.88 liters. Um, Now, after five breaths, I can change that. I can personalize it and might say, well, actually, it's early in the morning, 75 might be a bit too hard. Let's take it down to 65. Can I do a better breath on 65? So I want to kind of optimize that shape to improve my flow and volume whilst at the highest potential load. So that was on 65, and my average was 42, and that was on 65, my average was 43. And my flow rate, that's when I had it set on a higher load, and I was at 4.92 liters per second, 4.97, 5.1. So actually on 65, I'm generating a higher flow rate and the volume's pretty much the same. So I might say, okay, well, 65 is my optimum training level. I want to try and replicate all of those breaths to ideally make them overlap. If you went to the gym and your first rep was as good as your last rep was as good as your first rep, then you know you've done a good session and maybe you can increase the load next time.
Mhm. And
Equally,
over
sorry.
time, Duncan, I guess that it goes without saying, you're wanting all of these metrics to increase. So you
Mm,
talked about we're not increasing you have a fixed lung capacity, but the functional lung volume, so the amount of lung volume that you're using should increase along with all of the other metrics, I assume.
yes.
Yeah.
When at the moment I'm hitting, 3.8 liters, I know that if I train with this every day this week and into next week, I could improve my volume up to 5.2. And I know from past experience of using it regularly that 5.2 is where I kind of max out. No matter how hard I try, and I can train on 80, even 90 centimeters of water and still do 30 breaths of 5.2 liters and maintain that straight line.
Mhm. And
And then
obviously
I
there'll be
want,
limitations based on age, sex, age, gender, things like that that will
yes,
have your max. Yeah.
but again with training this, I think this age thing about people, lungs, getting smaller, etc. I'm quite old and I can still maintain it because I keep myself reasonably fit and I do power breathe
And your
training.
training, yeah. And we've had one question and it ties in with this because we talk about, so with tapered loading devices, which
Yes.
are unique to POWERbreathe and they adapt to your respiratory muscle strength, enabling you to train for longer in a session. Does that, in essence, mean that you will see the results more quickly than using a threshold device or
Um,
not?
will you see results more quickly? I think it will enable you to maximize your volume more quickly, definitely. If you're using a smart adapter with the Plus device, then because you do get visual feedback. Obviously, there's less of cost. It's not as sophisticated as this, so it will help you because the line when you open the valve and the valve closes, it changes color. So with that visual feedback, you can say, all right, so I need to try and keep that valve open for as long as possible.
Mm.
And that feedback helps you do it. So I'd say with the introduction of the smart adapter, it's bringing them closer together. And then it's down to budget, really, a plus on its own, a plus with the smart adapter, or the sophistication of a K series device.
Mhm. You touched earlier on we talked about flow and threshold and tapered loading devices. Can you just
Yeah.
explain what a flow device is and how that's different?
Well, there are flow devices on the market. You go on Amazon and there's no end of different types of products from all across the world. And most of them have never been tested. Most of them have never been used in any studies. And we can honestly say that we've had almost thousands of studies now using PowerBreathe. Where when I first started, 15 years ago, it was mainly Respironics devices that we used. Now they've been discontinued a few years ago, but even before that, people gradually switched over to PowerBreathe devices because we're probably the only company that's really been supporting IMT over these years. And it's good that we're a small privately owned company that we can continue to do that. A flow device is just basically a range of holes. So just like straws, you can have a small hole for high resistance and a big hole for low resistance. And it doesn't work as well as tapered load because with tapering loading, you can maintain that flow rate, but also maintain volume at the same time. With our Plus devices, because they do have a threshold valve, you can accurately measure the, the strength in terms of inspiratory and expiratory strength, and then create the correct training level. With a flow device, you could just keep breathing through a straw forever. There's no cut off. The valve doesn't close. Whereas with even ours is a tapered flow, the tapered flow valve does close at the ends because that's the way it's designed to work.
So it's essentially a more accurate training, more
Much,
repeatable training.
much more accurate and much more repeatable, and
Mm.
also much more quantifiable. Again, if you I see orders from customers and so where did you hear about PowerBreathe? And we get some very silly answers from some people, but you get genuine answers from other people, and people even say Chat GPT or my physio recommended it. So it's because over the last 15, 20 years we've amassed a great number of studies and and I must emphasize, they're not our studies. All studies are all independent. We haven't never funded one study.
Mm.
Any study that you read where they've used a PowerBreathe device, they've bought the devices, and we have no influence whatsoever. Sometimes it's quite a shock when a study comes out and we suddenly find a demand for the devices, which is unprecedented, and we wonder why. It's, oh yeah, they bought some PowerBreathes 3 years ago, and the study gets published and everybody wants one. Um, but you know, we've almost got too much information in the world at the moment, and things come and go. So it's coming back to what I said about habitual and making people realize the benefits and continuously doing it. So having recordings and feedback because that's going to improve motivation.
Mm.
We were talking earlier about you can personalize it, and then ideally you want some kind of telemonitoring to improve compliance because it's always compliance. Initially, it's motivation, which is linked to training and understanding and confidence. and then it's turning that into a habit, feeling the benefits of it and keeping it going. One guy once said to me at an exhibition, "Oh, I use POWERbreathe and it cured my asthma, so I stopped using it and my asthma came back." Well, one, he probably didn't have asthma in the first place. It was misdiagnosed and it was more of a poor breathing pattern. And B, he thought it was a quick cure and then you can't use it, but it's still use it or lose it. It's a piece of gym equipment ultimately. You have to keep the training going and maintain that progress.
Mm. But perhaps you don't necessarily need to keep doing 30 breaths twice a day
No,
forever and ever.
I mean, well, you just saw my MIP, and I don't use it 30 breaths twice a day because I've been using it for many years. So I'm demonstrating it quite often, so I get enough training doing that. So I would say you can throttle back into a maintenance mode of maybe Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or if you've got the with the smart adapter or with the K series where you can actually measure your strength and maximum inspiratory pressure. If it starts to drop, you can say, okay, I need to
Yeah.
get back into training again.
Yeah.
If I entered a marathon in 6 months' time, I'd say, right, I need to start my training again. I want to get back up to my 5.2 liters on 80 centimeters of water. And as with everything, all types of training, it's the weakest link in the chain.
Hmm.
So I might be running at the moment, saying, oh, this is great. I can breathe really easily. And then as I get faster and faster, then the breathing is the weakest link, and then it's the running, it's the quad muscles that's the weakest link. So you're always trying to identify the weak link and eliminate it, which then can also benefit your other training. A lot of the research says that the perception of effort is reduced, so you can go further and faster as well. And by improving your breathing pattern and making your respiratory muscle stronger, you can go further and faster because perception of effort is reduced.
Yeah. Just lastly, touching on because telemedicine, virtual patient monitoring, this is kind of a buzzword in the medical world for so many reasons. And the smart adapter is starting to give people that option to record sessions, have accountability. We had a question about how the successful breaths on the smart adapter is calculated. I didn't know if you could just go into that. Sometimes that confuses people. It's time and training, isn't it, when you've had successful breaths, when the valve is open?
A successful breath would be if you actually open the valve. Usually, if, for example, people do 10 breaths and nine are successful and one isn't, it's usually the first breath because they just didn't generate enough pressure to lift the valve.
Yeah. And I think, sorry, I was just seeing if there are any further questions. Where do you think, lastly, Duncan, where do you see the future of respiratory muscle training, given you've got 15 years of experience behind you? What do you think? What do you think is on the horizon?
Um, as I mentioned before, coaching, telemonitoring, maintaining, compliance and understanding and making it habitual. Um, Fortunately, more people are aware of breathing because you can read magazines now, fitness magazines, etc., and there'll be an article about breathing, whereas 10 years ago there wasn't, people, didn't understand it basically. So there's a much greater understanding now. So the greater understanding leads to experimentation, and then depending on which device people go for, if they're really absolutely certain and it's really important to them, they'll go for a K series. But if they think, well, I've read about this and some of my friends are doing it and they're doing a bit better than me now, I think maybe I should get one of those. And you're not still not certain, then you're buying it at the lowest level possible. So, well, okay, I'll get a plus. And then when you realize you get the benefits, then you say, well, I'll get a plus with a smart adapter, which enables me to have some visual feedback and monitor my progress. And then the smart adapter also has what are they called? Announcements on your phone, prompts. What's it called? There's a term for it. Your phone sends you a message.
Notifications.
That's the word. It will send notifications. So if you say, well, I don't want to do this on a full stomach, so I normally have my lunch at 12 o'clock. So I'm going to send myself a notification at 11:30 to remind you to do the training. And there'll be, enhancements on that. At the moment we're sponsoring PhD students at universities looking at the curves on the graphs and looking at new forms of telemedicine and communication to just make people more confident and more compliant and use it more often.
Brilliant. Well, I look forward to the next update, Duncan, after another 15 years of working in the field.
Well, so longevity, that's another benefit of POWERbreathe. I'm still alive.
As you say, it's training muscles that we often neglect, and you said it in your presentation. Everybody breathes. We often don't think that we can train those muscles, but if we do, you might start reaping the benefits.
Definitely.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your time
Thank you very
and
much.
sharing a very small insight of the many anecdotes that I know that you have and the wealth of experience that you've accrued working in the field of respiratory muscle training and with so many kind of pinnacle people and researchers and clinicians in the area. Thank you. I think everybody has found it very informative. As I said earlier, if there are any questions, please don't hesitate to get in contact via email or socials. And we look forward to working with you all in the future.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Duncan. Have a good
Cheers.
day. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.